In our last lesson, I gave you some quotes by whites of what they said about African people that has caused African people to not want to be African and to cause a cultural identity crisis. I'm going to continue with those, and so let's get to it. In the last lesson, I inadvertently skipped over one of the slides, and that is the one by David Hume, who was a Scottish philosopher, in an essay that he wrote back in 1768, where he said, I am apt to suspect the Negroes, that is, Africans, to be naturally inferior to the white. There never was a civilized nation of any other complexion than white, nor even any individual eminent either in action or speculation. Clearly, here he is advocating the notion of racism, white supremacy. Our next quote comes from Richard Burton, who was an explorer and a writer in the latter part of the 19th century, who said, the study of the Negro, that is the African, is the study of man's rudimentary mind. He would appear rather a degeneracy from the civilized man than a savage rising to the first step, were it not for his total incapacity for improvement. The next statement is from John W. Burgess, who was a scholar at Columbia University in New York City, who said, a black skin means membership in a race of men which has never created a civilization of any kind. There is something natural in the subordination of an inferior race, even to the point of enslavement of the inferior race. Clearly, here he is stating unabashedly that African people are uncivilized. And this, by the way, remember, is from a professor at Columbia University, one of the Ivy Leagues, that was well accepted at that time. Next, we have Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, who said, I have no purpose to introduce a political and social equality between the white and black races. There is a physical difference between the two, which, in my judgment, will probably forever forbid them from living together upon the footing of perfect equality. And I, as much as any man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race. Next, we have Dr. Robert Bennett Bean in the Journal of Anatomy in 1906 on the peculiarities of the Negro brain, who said, and by the way, he was a descendant of Thomas Jefferson. He says, having demonstrated that the Negro and the Caucasian are widely different in characteristics due to a deficiency in the Negro brain, a deficiency which that is hereditary, we are forced to conclude that it is useless to try to elevate the Negro by education or otherwise. So when you hear these type of statements, you can begin to understand today why there is a lack of equal footing in terms of education between blacks and whites. But I'll continue. Next, we have a statement by Professor A.P. Newton in 1923. He was a professor of imperial history at the University of London, who said, Africa had no history before the coming of the Europeans. History only begins when men take to writing. And since Africa had no knowledge of writing, information on African history could be found only in material remains, in language, and in primitive culture. These are the concerns of linguists, archaeologists, and anthropologists, and not the concern of historians. Now, during my classes and in my deeper dive classes, I go into why this statement is so glaringly, blatantly wrong and racist, particularly as it applies to writing. African people are the oldest people on the planet, have been writing for the longest time. The Europeans only started writing around the time of Thales, around 800 BC and BCE. That is almost 3,000 years or more after the Africans started writing. But I digress. Let's move on to the next. Arnold Toynbee, British historian, who said, when we Westerners, and that means we whites. And so I bring up this point at this point. When you hear the word Western or Westerners, it is a euphemism for the word white. When we Westerners call people natives, we implicitly take the cultural color out of our perceptions of them. We see them as trees walking or as wild animals infesting the country in which we happen to come across them. In fact, we see them as part of the local flora and fauna and not as men of like passions with ourselves. And seeing them thus as something infrahuman, we feel entitled to treat them as though they did not possess ordinary human rights. Next, we go to Charles Senebos at the University of Paris in his work, The History of Ancient Civilizations, where he says, almost all civilized people belong to the white race. The people of other races have remained savage or barbaric, like the men of prehistoric times. Again, Arnold Toynbee, who says, when we classify mankind by color, the only one of the primary races which has not made a creative contribution to any of our 21 civilizations is the black race. And so we're beginning to see, or should see, why black people do not want to be associated with Africa because of these and other statements. Next, we have Albert Schweitzer, MD, in 1961 wrote that the Negro is a child, and with children, nothing can be won without the use of authority. With regard to the Negroes, then, I have coined the phrase, I am your brother, it is true, but your elder brother. Our next statement comes from Professor Hugh Trevor Roper from the Modern History Department at Oxford, who said, nowadays undergraduates demand that they should be taught African history. Perhaps in the future there will be some African history to teach, but at the present there is none. There is only the history of the Europeans in Africa. The rest is darkness, and darkness is not a subject of history. The present world is one that is dominated by European techniques, European examples, and the European ideas. Nothing but white supremacy. It is these which have shaken the non-European world out of its past, out of barbarism in Africa. The history of the world for the last 5 centuries, insofar as it has significance, been European history. The study of history must therefore be Eurocentric. We cannot thus afford to amuse ourselves with the unrewarding gyrations of barbarous tribes in picturesque but irrelevant corners of the globe. And I'm going to stop right there for now. But you see, we've come from 1748 all the way up to 1963, a period of 215 years. And we see that the sentiment has not changed. The drum against African people, the negativeness against African people had no let up. And we're going to continue this in our next lesson. So make sure that you follow, share, and like, and I'll see you in the next lesson. And this is only a piece of the puzzle.